nerding in the Gospel of John. We've done Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This is all going to be about the Gospel of John and many nerdy, amazing facts. So you're going to want to read this Gospel more after you hear this stuff. So first, Pastor Brenda, really glad to meet you in this space. I really appreciate you coming. If you like this, hit like, hit subscribe, and we'll see you again, maybe even on a Friday night. So about this gospel, we have the Synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're named that because they're the same as in the word synonym, synoptic, the same there. And then we have this Gospel of John. It's written by one of the disciples named John. Now we find out in Mark 3:17 that Jesus nicknamed John and his brother James the sons of thunder. That doesn't sound like a flattering name. Sounds like they're a bunch of hotheads, right? So it becomes really interesting that at the end of John's long life, and he was the longest lived disciple, he was not martyred. He actually ended up dying of old age. At the end of his life, he was known as John the Beloved. So something happened in John's life when he was the son of thunder, and Jesus called him to be one of the disciples. And then he grew to be this beloved saint of the church and died of old age. We know what happened, right? He met Jesus. So John was the son of Zebedee and Salome, a native of Bethsaida. It's also where Philip, Andrew, and Peter were from. And it was a city in Galilee, which is also that area that was slighted by the Judeans, and on the shore of Lake Gennesaret. His family was fairly well off because they were fishermen. They had their own business. So in Galilean sense, he had his own business and does a job with his father. John was a disciple of John the Baptist until he was called to follow Jesus at the outset of Jesus' ministry. John 1:35-36 says, the following day, John was again standing with two of his disciples, unnamed, but James and John, they find out. As Jesus walked by, John looked at him, John the Baptist, and said, "Look, there is the Lamb of God." When John's two disciples heard this, they followed Jesus, which kind of tells us that John was already spiritually seeking, which is why he was already following John the Baptist, and then took opportunity when this rabbi called him to have another opportunity to not just be a fisherman, but to become more educated and follow the way of the rabbi. And he took his opportunities. I think John was already a spiritual seeker. Now you'll notice there, even in that telling of John the Baptist and John, that John's name is not mentioned. It's actually not mentioned in the entire gospel. Other than John the Baptist, that name is mentioned, but John himself does not refer to himself by name, but often as the other disciple or the disciple whom Jesus loved, which sounds kind of braggadocious, and maybe it is, but I've also, in the study of this, I just read that, this is a theory, put it out there in concentric circles, an opinion, that he was so beloved that the scribes that wrote for him changed this after his death to say the disciple whom Jesus loved, because he was so beloved. It was a term of endearment, a term of honor for this much beloved leader in the church. So maybe John was braggadocious, maybe John was just descriptive, or maybe his disciples changed it as an honor to him. I don't know. Just one of those thoughts. Like the other Gospels, its authorship is anonymous, but like the other Gospels also, it was attributed to John, and the Greek book writing, it was named after the author who wrote it, not after a flowery title. That's just the way the Greeks did it. All four Gospels follow that pattern. But this is an interesting one. John is writing the Gospel of John is accredited because it is very similar in writing style to the first, second, and third epistles. And then this is an interesting fact. Polycarp, if you know church history, you'll know that name. He was a 2nd century Christian martyr who knew John personally, because they lapped over in life here. And he told Bishop Irenaeus, we've also mentioned him throughout the series, that John had written the gospel. So Polycarp was a first witness who told Irenaeus that John was the author of this gospel, and that he had written it during the time he served the church of Ephesus. So this would be at the end of John's life. So, and then to say, first century historian Eusebius also confirmed this in his historical, not biblical writing. So, we find out through church history that John started the church in Ephesus, left when Paul came, and then returned to the church of Ephesus. So that church of Ephesus, hot dog, did they have good pastors there, right? But we also learned, we're going to do a series in the future here of this church on the book of 1 John. We're studying that right now in our theology circle, that the epistles of 1 John and 2 John and 3 John were actually written to the church of Ephesus. I did not know that I did not know that. Don't think less of me. And that the church of Ephesus was undergoing some scattering of people as heresy was coming into the church already. And John wrote those epistles to say, stay true to the beloved, and we'll get to that in the whole series. It's just interesting. But while he went back to Ephesus late in life, again, to gather the church together to become strong, is when he wrote this gospel. Kind of very reflective on his life. Anyway, just understanding that picture? Okay. John is mentioned 3 times in the book of Acts. Each time it was in association with Peter, so they teamed up here after any resurrection hubbub there. They teamed up in Acts 3:1, Acts 4:13, and Acts 8:14. And in Acts 9 there is when the story of Acts turns into the story of Paul. So John and Peter fall off the scene there. But just know they probably did a lot of ministry together late in life. According to Revelation 1:9, John was exiled to the island of Patmos by the Romans at the end of his life. He was probably released from there and died in Ephesus. So we just historically know this, biblically know this. And if you look at a map, Patmos, which is still an island today, is located outside of Turkey, which is where Ephesus is found. So he just hopped off the island when he was released from his punishment and went back to Ephesus there and took care of the church till he died. Makes sense, right? But it's a nerding fact, but it makes sense. John was an eyewitness to Jesus' crucifixion. He was the one disciple that followed all the way to the end. And we know this just because he was given the care of Mary from the cross. We're going to talk about this story more in 2 weeks. We talk about unnecessary details about the Passion story. So just leave that for there right now. We believe that the final form of John's whole story of the gospel was AD 90 to 110, somewhere in there. It's a 20-year span, but somewhere in there is when he finished it up. And I think when you read the Gospel of John, I think the earlier part of it, there's more stories of Jesus' life, like John is reminiscing, maybe even journaling all along here. But when it gets to John 13, to the end, all of a sudden it gets to be really what Jesus was teaching, like John was there. And this is Jesus' life message put into these verses before the crucifixion story and before the resurrection. This part, I think John must have written at the end of his life. I do. It's opinion, put it out there where you like. Where he was telling us what Jesus taught him that changed his life in those last chapters. Because he's reflecting at the end of his life. John's purpose in writing this is stated in John 20:31, end of the book here. He says, that you may believe in that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. This is John. The word life appears, where is this? 36 times. None of the other Gospels use that word this much. But this is important. There's a whole reason he wrote this at the end of his life, so that you may have life like he has found life. He's gone from son to thunder to beloved because of what Jesus has done in his heart. So that really matters to him. Let me see here. This was written in Greek, like the other Gospels. It was also probably written in community with a lot of input from scribes, like a shared writing like we talked about in our How to Read the Bible series. And more than 90% of John is unique from the other Gospels. They didn't borrow from Mark like the others. He just wrote his own version of all the stories, and 90% of it is different. John seems to be preoccupied with where Jesus is all the time, both geographically and more specifically within a city. He gives us lots of details about Jerusalem. These unnecessary details coming up next week, by the way. And this is a theory. Again, I put this out as an opinion theory here, but I picked this up from theologian Scott McKnight that I love and respect. I read a lot of his stuff, so here's one of my influences. He believes John might have been written as a script. The Roman Greek culture at that time was doing a lot of play acting, a lot of theater, a lot of hypocrisy with that if you read in the original Greek, there is a lot of dialogue in John, like it was a scripted story. And there's a lot of irony written that we don't pick up in the English as well, but you do in the Greek. And it's written with the irony in it to like like in a play. So I am going to be reading the Gospel of John coming up here with this take, because I'm kind of curious how that reads, having that thought. So I just give you that same burden. See what happens, okay? All right, so I'm going to mention one of the stories that's only mentioned in the Gospel of John and give you some crazy details. This is the miracle of turning water into wine. It's one of our favorites, right? It's John's only one that records this. And while I cannot tell you how that water into wine happened, I can't find those nerdy details. There's a couple ones here I want to share with you. John mentions that traveling to Cana is downhill. John 4:46, as he traveled through Galilee, he came to Cana, where he had turned the water into wine. There was a government official in nearby Capernaum whose son was very sick. And then also in John 4:51, as he was going down, his servants met him and told him that his son was recovering. So we got this geographical fact that is confirmed by maps. Okay, it's an unnecessary detail, but it actually tells you that Cana was a location and how to find it. And it was a downward path from Jerusalem, which is mostly true because Jerusalem is the city on the hill, literally. All right. And then in John 5:1, he said, after this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. There's that is again. So what we don't know about the water turned into wine, but we do know about those stone jars that the wine went into, okay? And archaeologists have discovered a location where stone water parts were manufactured in the vicinity of the suggested location of Cana. So Cana was known for these large stone jars, and this is mentioned in the wedding story. But what we aren't told is why the jars were there, except now we kind of know why the jars are there, but also why were they empty? Because they had to be empty for the water to go into, right? To fill them, to have them turned into wine. And you would think if there was a party that they might be full of water for the guests to have. But we find another undesigned coincidence here in Mark 7:1-5, explaining why the jars are empty. And we talked about the Gospel of Mark was written to Greeks, and Mark was trying to explain the Jewish rituals to the Greeks in his writing. Here's one of those instances. So, 7:1-5. One day, some Pharisees and teachers of religious law arrived from Jerusalem to see Jesus. They noticed that some of his disciples failed to follow the Jewish ritual of hand washing before eating. The Jews, especially the Pharisees, do not eat until they have poured water over their cupped hands, as required by their ancient traditions. Similarly, they don't eat anything from the market until they immerse their hands in water. This is but one of the many traditions they have clung to, such as their ceremonial washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. Okay? You might read that and think that's just, you read over it because it's details that don't matter, but this does matter in some historical fact. And so these stone water jars were actually emptied because they were used for the purification ritual before the wedding. Another nerdy fact that one of the people from my church came up with, I got to give Heidi credit for this. She's more of a math brain than I am. So we read in this gospel story that there were 6 stone jars that hold 20 to 30 gallons. She did the math in like 1 second and figured out that's 500 bottles of wine that came out of that water. Not only was it the best wine, it was the most wine. All right. Yeah, may you never unsee this again. All right. Another one. The washing of feet story is only told in John 13. This is the point where John really gets serious about what Jesus taught them. And John 14, 15, 16, 17, beautiful verses. Then we get to the Passion story. But there's just John's teaching of what Jesus taught them is just rich here. And he begins with this story of washing of feet. But what we miss, I'm going to make this an undesigned coincidence, is Luke tells a story that fits right next to this as to why Jesus washed their feet. Now, I don't know why Luke didn't tell the story, and I don't know why John did not include this part of the story, but when you put these together, it makes so much sense. So let me begin with Luke. Luke 22, 24 to 27. Then they began to argue among themselves about who would be the greatest among them. Jesus told them, "In this world, the kings and the great men lord it over their people, yet they are called friends of the people. But among you it will be different. Those who are the greatest among you should take the lowest rank, and the leaders should be like a servant. Who is more important, the one who sits at the table or the one who serves? The one who sits at the table, of course, but not here, for I am among you as one who serves." That's Luke's telling. And then you read in John 13 about this, he washes their feet. Do you see the unfolding of the story right there? It is just incredible. I'm going to unfold it for you. John 13, 12 through 17. After washing their feet, he put on his robe again and sat down and asked, "Do you understand why I did this? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, because that's what I am. And since I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash each other's feet. I've given you an example to follow. Do as I have done to you. I tell you the truth, slaves are not greater than their master, nor is the messenger more important than the one who sends the message. Now that you know these things, God will bless you for doing them." These stories fit together. And isn't this how Jesus taught? We read in the Gospels, they're walking along the way. Look at the harvest. The harvest field is ripe. He made a lesson out of that. The disciples are eating wheat out of that field. He made a lesson out of that. He saw a shepherd. He made a lesson out of that. Surely what happened in Luke with the disciples trying to be the greatest, he made a lesson out of that. And then John records what that lesson was physically by the washing of feet. Isn't that beautiful? Jesus did that same lesson again in Mark 9:33 through 37. After they arrived at Capernaum, they settled in a house. And Jesus asked his disciples, "What were you discussing out on the road?" But they didn't answer because they had been arguing about which of them was the greatest. Okay? This didn't happen once. He sat down, called the 12 disciples over to him, and said, "Whoever wants to be first must take last place and be a servant among them." And then he put a child among them. Then he put the little child among them. Taking the child in his arms, he said to them, "Anyone who welcomes a little child like this on my behalf welcomes me. And anyone who welcomes me welcomes not only me, but also the Father who sent me." Same practice, but he taught it with a child this time, not with the washing of feet. Because this is the message of Jesus. This is the gospel giving us the good news and this way of Jesus, where we are to power under in our choices and not be striving for power, but to be like Jesus, to be like a child, to be like washing other people's feet, to serve first so you can have power in that person's life. So this is my benediction message to you. May you be like Jesus. May you find ways to power under this week and see that Jesus be lifted up and you as well, because this is the way of Jesus. See you again.